Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ewan Brown from Australian Monitor. We have Peter Cleary from Amber. Thank you very much for joining for this ZONEMIX webinar, and specifically the ZONEMIX control software. So this is the second part in our webinar series for the ZONEMIX, and let's jump straight into it. Sorry, I'll need to share my screen. Apologies. So per our last webinar, this is the ZONEMIX solution. It consists of two products, the ZONEMIX 4 and the ZONEMIX 8, 4-zone and 8-zone. And in addition to that, it has three control panels, WP4R, WP10 and WP volume, audio wall panels, the control software which we're about to speak specifically about, and then the ZMPS paging station. So that is the hardware for the ZONEMIX system. And now let's go into the ZONEMIX control software. Next page, sorry. So the ZONEMIX control software, it consists of the basic audio setup of the system in terms of levels, where you want inputs to be routed to the output zones, various volume levels, filters, compressors, tone controls, etc. It also has an inbuilt priority scheme, and that goes all the way from evacuation signals down to inputs that can mute other inputs, and we'll go into more detail on that section. We will also then proceed into how the scheduler works, and then all of the features around the setup and control of the pagers and wall panels. So this is each section as we go through it. Very briefly, how you get the software and how you configure it, how you connect to the system using USB or Ethernet, the audio mix levels, conditioning, into the priority scheme, then through into the wall panels and paging setup, how you set up the date and time for accurate use of the scheduler, and then how you can set up tasks to work with the scheduler, all of the basics around the scheduler, the wall panels, GPIO, and then finally how you do third-party control using the system and do more advanced configuration features. So if we jump straight into the software. I close here. So this is the basics of the control the control software, and how you would access that is, as you would guess, going to our website. And if I just bring this across here, go into ZONEMIX 8, which is the system that we will be demoing today. Under downloads, and then into the latest control software. If you have systems that are already in the field, you can also go to previous control software versions if they were deployed 6 months ago, for example, and you don't want to do any form of upgrade in the system. Within our software download section, you can see previous versions of the control software. So that gives you options if you want to upgrade the system to the latest or not.
And if you've got any questions during this, just drop them into the chat and we'll answer them as we go.
So download the software, follow the installer, all very basic, and then you get to this screen, which is the connection window. So the ZONEMIX has the ability to connect over USB, which is what we'll be showing today, but it can also connect over the network. So with the network settings, you have the ability for it to automatically detect the ZONEMIX on the network. So you need to make sure you're on the same subnet as the ZONEMIX, and it will auto detect it, and you can just connect to it. If you don't have that capability, you can go into the custom network side, set your IP address that you want to connect to, and do it manually that way. So there's the automated way in terms of DHCP, which is basically the assignment of the IP address from your network, or you can do it via a custom network connection. In addition to that, you can also see the IP address on the front panel of the product. When you power cycle the product, as it's booting up, it will print the IP address so that you can easily see how to connect to it. To begin with, you should connect using the USB and then set up the network if you want to do a custom connection, and I'll show you that in a moment. So when you connect over USB, if you then want to come in on the network, you can then come into the network page. You can set up the IP address. Is it a fixed IP address? Is it DHCP? Is it a host name if you want to automatically connect using a host name? And we will show the third-party control later. So this is really the basics of connecting over the network, setting the IP address, and if it's DHCP. We have a question that's come in.
Question is there any built-in safety mechanism with regards to firmware checks and updates? We had a pre-configured ZONEMIX and sent it to site to be installed by another tech.
Yep, so the last bit is that they had sent that to the field and it had overridden the original config. So the system should do automatic retrieval of the current configuration from the device, update the system, and then feed back the previous configuration. So in that specific instance, it should not have done that. It has been specifically built to deal with the fact that you have deployed a system, you come back in a year's time. If you do an update, it will suck out the existing configuration from the device, update the whole system, and then send back the configuration to the device. So that's how it should operate. Thank you for that question. So once you've connected to the system, we would then set up the audio mix. And could you bring up the PowerPoint, please? Sorry, so you would set up the mix of the system. So first of all, along the top, you have the 8 zones because we are showing a ZONEMIX 8 in this demonstration. So for each zone, you can select along here to change the zone. But if we select zone 1, you would then set the level for the inputs that you want in that zone. For this example, if we were doing input 1 and 2, we would then come into the system. Now I have an audio source coming in on input 1 and 2, which I've just activated, and that's what you would see. So you're getting the metering of the input coming in, and then you can adjust the volume levels for those 2 inputs to then go to the output. So you have your input levels along here, you have your master volume on the output, and then if you're not using other inputs, it's recommended that you mute them, and that gives you the best noise performance in the system. And then finally, if you were using a local input, and the local input means if you connected a Bluetooth wall panel in the zone or another balanced audio input that is being fed from the zone and into the ZONEMIX, you can then also adjust the level accordingly for that local input as well. So that's the basics of how you would set it up, and then you would go into the next zone and you would then change its configuration as well. So you'll note that this is completely independent mixing of each input to output. So if I come back into zone 1, you'll see that these 2 are both being used, but in zone 2, it's input 2 that's being used there if I then change the level. If you have then set up the configuration and you want to prevent the user from making too many changes to the mix, for example, if you adjust the volume too low, you can turn on this advanced setting and it brings up these settings of max and min values. So you can set that to a minimum value to prevent end users from muting the system, for example, or the max level from making the level too loud. So that's how you set the restriction for the end user in terms of the volume controls in the mix. In addition to the inputs, which are inputs 1 to 6 of the ZONEMIX, there are also some additional sources that bypass the master. So this is what this note here says. These outputs here will bypass the zone master volume, and that is the paging, any tone or scheduler leveling, and this is a commissioning sign or pink noise generator. So the idea behind this is that you are setting the microphone level of the paging station. You're then setting the corresponding page or chime message if that is active. So in this case, I am deliberately making the chime volume less than the microphone so you don't get a chime blasting through to the end user. And this level has nothing to do with the zone master volume level. So a user in the zone could be adjusting the wall panel, changing the zone master level, and it will not affect the paging level, which is deliberate because you don't want the ability for them to circumvent the paging coming. That is the case for all output zones. So again, they're independently set for each output zone. So you have that flexibility. It is not a global based setting. It is on an individual zone setting. Once you've set the basic levels in the system, there are also filters that you can apply to inputs 1 and 2. And typically that would be if we were changing this mode, for example, that you could change that to mic level. You could also change it to apply phantom power, and then you can apply filtering to that if necessary on those inputs for microphones, for example. On each of the outputs, you have the ability to then apply filters to them. So there is a high pass and low pass filter option. Again, if you were doing it for subwoofers, for example, or you wanted to tune the room. There are also tone controls, basic bass and treble, and then a compressor or a limiter. So you just set that here. If I bring the limiter in, you can see the settings there. These settings are frankly too detailed for this presentation, so I'm just showing that the system has this capability. And then finally, you have an inversion if you need that based on the input connections. So that is the basic mixing of the system and the audio conditioning. If there are any questions at this point, then please send them through. But we will now move on to the priority scheme. So once you've set up all of the levels in the system, we then come into the priority scheme, and this is a capability within the ZONEMIX that you can have evacuation tones trigger to mute all of the outputs, for example, and prevent any audio coming out during an evacuation of a building, all the way down to if a microphone is active on input 1, then what do you want the system to do in terms of muting other inputs? So for the moment, we will start with the evacuation tone. That is the tone generator on the back of the product. It is a input where you connect the evacuation input to the ground, so a contact closure. And then if that triggers, that will then mute the rest of the system. So it has the highest level priority, which is what's mentioned here, and then we cascade down from here. So if the evacuation tone is active, none of the settings below it will take effect. If the master override is active, again, sections 3 and 4 will not take effect. So I will show the master override later, but for the moment, I'll show a far more common use case. So what we're seeing in the normal operation, so we're not talking about evacuation or any time in the system where it's an abnormal mode of operation that you're having to evacuate, etc. If this is just normal operation, what do you want the audio to do when you detect different audio inputs? So in zone 1, how I have it set at the moment is if any paging happens, that will take the highest priority. So what that will mean is if any other input is active, it will be muted. Now, input 1 is also set to priority level 1. So what that means is it will mix with the paging. So if I adjust that to input level 2, it is then a lower priority and only the paging will be active. So I'm sorry, I'm going to say that again because that was confusing because I had it at the same level. So the way that it's set now, because paging is priority level 1 and nothing else is priority level 1, it will take priority and mute everything below it. If I then set, for example, input 1 to the same priority level, it would mean if either of these are active at the same time, they will mix together. And if either one of them is active, it will mute any lower one. So for example, if I then make input 2 to priority level 2, input 1 would then mute input 2. So if I then save this configuration, I will then explain this in more detail, what's happening. I'm going to trigger an input source. So when I'm playing the source, what it's saying is that using this key here, when it's green like this, it is triggered and active. So what that's saying is I am detecting a level on input 1, which would be this color. But in addition to that, it is now this color because it's active. There isn't a higher level priority that is overriding it. And that's the same case on zone 3, that although the priority level is set to 3, there is nothing higher than it, which is overriding it. Now, what I just did there was pressed the paging station all call button. So I'm going to do that again, and what you're going to see again is that the paging announcements all become active, but then input 1 on zone 3, for example, is then not active. Okay, so that is how you set up the system and how you can use that color coding to understand how you're actually going to set up the priority scheme.
Adrian, with the mixing on priority, is there a way to set the weight given to each input being mixed?
Yeah, oh, sorry, I'll just say that a bit louder. With the mixing on the priority, is there a way to set the weight given to each input being mixed? So that is what I was just about to come to in the priority levels. So within the setting, it allows you to, first of all, set the threshold, the attack and the release, and then are the other inputs being ducked or muted? So for example, if input 1 was then muting the lower inputs, what are the level that the lower inputs go to? So currently they're being muted, but if I set this to -20, what it would mean is if input 1 triggered, input 2 would reduce its volume to -20. And then once the priority had been removed, it would then go back to its previous setting. So I'm just rereading again. With the mixing on the priority, is there a way to set the weight given to each input being mixed? I'm not exactly sure what he means by weight. That's from Adrian. So, yeah, okay. I apparently have answered the question. Okay. With the release, that is meant to be when the priority has been triggered and it's then been removed. How long is it before the mute or the duck is removed from the system? So you'll see, as shown right here, that if you hover over any of these controls, you'll get a tooltip to explain exactly what they are. So that's very helpful because there's so many settings within the system. Go back to the slideshow, please. Now, that would be the normal operation for the system. And again, if you wanted to use the evacuation, alert, and intruder, you could also use those on the rear of the product to trigger into the priority scheme. I want to specifically also mention the master override. This allows you some more extended features that you can trigger it from a general purpose input, or you can trigger it from an audio source. So for some more legacy fire control panels, instead of using a logic output from the fire panel, they will sometimes use an audio signal, and that is where this setting would be used, that you're effectively detecting an audio trigger coming into the system. And then what are you doing? Are you muting all outputs, or are you going to override all outputs with a specific source? So if I had enabled that, you could then come in here, which input are you using? What are the levels? And then what do you want to do? Do you want to override that source? Do you want to play another source? So there's a lot of flexibility in that master override setting as well. Okay, moving on. We are then into the wall panels. So what I'm showing here are two wall panels that are connected to the ZONEMIX system, the WP4R and the WP10 here. As you can see along the top, there are 16 tabs. It supports up to 16 wall panels in the ZONEMIX system. But I have prepared these just so that we can proceed quickly with this webinar. But ultimately, when you are connecting a wall panel to the system, you basically wire it to the system and then follow this procedure in terms of pairing to it. So you're holding down two buttons as shown on each of the wall panels, and then clicking the pair button. That will then pair it to the system, and then this is ultimately what you will see. So you have the ability on the wall panels to then come in and configure each of the buttons that are in the wall panel. So there are an awful lot of settings in here, and I won't go through all of them in this webinar, but some common ones are that do you want to control a source input? So this would be, are you wanting to enable or disable an input for that zone? So I'll just do one at the moment, that is saying this controller, it doesn't necessarily need to be in zone 1. It could be at reception, for example, and be a master controller. But a typical use case would be if you are assigning this wall panel to be in zone 1, it allows it to enable or disable input 1 as a source. You then come to the rotary encoder on the output, and then you're saying, I want to set this to be the zone 1 master volume control. And that is how you set up each of the buttons on the wall panels. So then come into the WP10, and what you can then see in this example is because it is not a rotary encoder and is physical buttons, you're then assigning this one to be volume up on zone 1 master and this one to be volume down. We will come to this later, but I just want to highlight that you also have the ability to trigger tasks from the task management, which we're about to go into later. But that gives you the capability of running automated tasks, things like playing messages, running presets, etc., etc. So I'll go through all of that later when we go into the task management, but I wanted to highlight those as a key feature within the wall panels. So we then come to the pagers, and again, this gives you some explanations in terms of how you set up the paging. And as I mentioned before, in terms of the levels, when you set the paging stations for each zone, it's very important that you do set the levels. If you configure the paging stations, you pair them, you configure them, and then you try and do a page and nothing happens, it's quite likely that you've forgotten to increase the volume in that zone for the paging station. So this is serving as a little bit of a warning to ensure that you set that up within the system. So the ZONEMIX supports 16 paging stations, and you're seeing the 16 tabs along the top. I currently have one paging station in the system. I've already pre-assigned this. When you page to begin with, all of them will be set grayed out like this. But again, for the sake of brevity in this webinar, I've pre-configured it. So the paging station has 8 buttons on the left and 8 buttons on the right, but 3 are dedicated. So there are 8 programmable on the left, 5 programmable on the right, and then 3 dedicated buttons for all paging clearing. So for this example, I'm using all of the left ones to allow you to individually select each of the zones that you want to page to. So for example, you would select the first button, and then you would do a zone page, and that would page only to that zone. Or if you selected this button and this button, you've now selected both zones 1 and 2, and then you can page to both of them. So that's giving you the flexibility for your end user to select which zone they want to page to, and then they can do it. Alternatively, they can just do an all page, and that will automatically select all the zones and page to them. On the right-hand side here, we're showing examples of how you create group zones. So instead of having to individually select all of the zones that you want to, if there are very common groups that you want to page to, this is how you would then set them. So for example, I have 4 set up here. Add another one, you're now paging to all 5. So the one press of the button will select all 5 zones, and then you can page to it. This one is also showing group paging without chimes being active. So we have use cases where people don't want the chimes to be active, and that is the legend that is shown here. So what I'm doing here is I'm just selecting it again and cycling through the 3 options here. So that is how you can convert them to say no chime in a zone. So if I again change that one, zone 5 will not play a chime, but zones 6, 7, and 8 will play the chime. So that gives you the customization of the chime as well. And finally, there is the ability to play pre-recorded messages from the SD card. So there is an optional SD card slot within the product. You can supply your SD card with files pre-installed onto it. You then come in here. You then say, I want a pre-recorded message, browse to it. These are the files that are on the SD card on my demo unit here. You can then save it. That's then a pre-recorded message that will play back, and you just select which zones you want it to play to. So that gives you the ability to have pre-recorded paging announcements or message playback, whatever you wish. Okay, so we're now about to talk about the scheduler, but a key point before the scheduler is to ensure that the date and time is set correctly, or the scheduler clearly won't work at the right time. So first of all, it's saying no daylight savings exists. That's fine. We're going to proceed. If you are in a territory that there are daylight savings, Australia being one of them, this is the pre-configured period that daylight savings exists for Australia. You can then add that range to it, and then you'll see that that goes all the way to 2050. So daylight savings is supported, and then it's supported for various countries. If there is a country that is different and not pre-configured, you can select other and then configure that yourself. Once you've done the daylight savings, then you're selecting how do you want the date and time to be captured in the system. At the moment, it's set to manual mode, and that's because I don't have a network connection. So that's default out the box. There is a real-time clock within the product. It is approximately accurate to 30 seconds every year. So again, depending on your application, how critical it is, you could do a manual mode. If you have the option, we'd highly recommend that you connect it to a network that supplies network time. So you would then be selecting network time, selecting your time zone, and then you could sync to it. You have the ability to change the addresses that it's picking up the network time from. And once that's done, you would have extremely accurate time ready for the scheduler. So that's how you would configure the date and time. Moving into the scheduler, first of all, I just want to highlight the reason it's red is because we've not turned it on yet, and we'll see that in a moment. There is a very brief help here. There is a far more detailed help within the manual, but this is hopefully a cheat sheet for basic setup of the scheduler to avoid having to go into the manual every time. So within the scheduler, the very first thing is, do you want to enable it? So once we've enabled it, you'll see that it's green here. And the scheduler can be enabled and disabled from multiple sources. It can be done from the wall panels, etc., from general purpose inputs that allow you just to completely disable the scheduler and turn it off for that day or the time period that you wish. And that gives you control over the scheduler without having to go into the ZONEMIX control software. So once we've turned on the scheduler, it is a view that is very similar to Outlook, for example. But the first step is, as you're walking along the top here, the first step is to create tasks and groups. We would then, once we've assigned the task and group, created it, we would then assign those to a task schedule or to a day schedule. So we'll first of all start with the step one of creating the tasks. Within the tasks, we first of all create one, and then what are the actions that we want for that task. So here are the options that are available in terms of adjusting volume, applying mutes, tones, messages, etc. I'll very briefly show each of them so that we can see what they do. I won't go into every detail on them. On the adjustment of volume, you're first of all selecting the zone that you want to adjust. Are you overriding the output? For example, you're making that -20. So whatever setting it is currently set to, when you activate this task, it will set it to -20. You then, if you want to also adjust the input sources for the zone, you then individually say, I want to override whichever one is appropriate. So that gives the ultimate flexibility that you're not, for example, if you didn't want to adjust input 2, then you just don't override it. So it's giving you the granular ability to adjust each input that is required for that zone. So that would be the setting. We're saying for zone 3, we're going to change the master volume to -20. We're going to effectively mute this. We'll change this to -50, etc., etc. And that then allows you to make a volume adjustment. Then giving that a sensible name in terms of ZONEMIX 3, volume adjust, something like that, that allows you to reference it later. What you can also do, if I create another task, which is a volume adjustment, if I copy it from the current volume of zone 1, you'll see that it's actually copied those across. So that's a nice, easy way of copying the levels that are coming from that are currently set in that zone. We then move on to mute and unmute. So very, very similar to the just volume, just simply, do you want to mute the inputs or the output? And then we come into tones. So the tone generator on the product, it has an integrated evac, alert, intruder, chime, and bell tone. So you're selecting which one do you want, which are the zones that you want it to go to, and how long do you want it to run for. So you can do a custom length of time that you're running indefinitely until the task is removed, or you can run it for 10 seconds, for example, and then it will automatically stop. You can put delays on the front of that to give you time before the tone starts, and also how many times do you want it to repeat as well. And you can do that with all of the tones. Similar, there are the messages. So when you're selecting a message, it's automatically going to the SD card and asking what is the message that you want to play. Just select one. And then again, what are the zones that you want that message to be played to? Do you want it to play the full length of the track, or do you want to play an excerpt of the track? Do you want delays? Do you want to repeat it? How many times do you want to repeat it? Do you want to add delays in between the repeats, and any delays after the message is completed? So a lot of customization that can be done there. Equally, what you can do is cascade messages together. So if you have multiple files and you don't want to have to merge them with external software into one file, you could then create multiple messages in here and then play a secondary message. And if you want to cascade them together, you then create a group. So what you can come into here is, first of all, you want to create a group. You want to say 2 messages, for example, and then you add the 2 tasks together to it. Oh, sorry, it can't start with a number. So I'll just call it group 2. So we then add tasks to it, the 2 messages. We are then going to add these 2 together, and then it gives you the ability to add a delay between the messages. So this gives you even more flexibility, that you can have multiple messages playing one after the other and then triggered using this group. So you create individual tasks all down here, and then if you want to do sequences and group them together, that's how you would do it. You'd create a group and then add in the tasks to it. So the final things are in the task. Yep, sorry, I'll show that in a second. Sorry, I'll show you that now. As Peter was just saying, that you have the capability of uploading files to the ZONEMIX, and that's where you would do it from here. So selecting the upload then directs you to your PC. You can then select any file and then upload it directly to the SD card, so that you can do that if it's in a remote installation, for example, that allows you to do remote uploading of files rather than having to remove the SD card and put it into a laptop. If you're doing a lot of files on commissioning, we'd highly recommend that you do it with your computer, because it will take quite a while to upload them all. But you have that flexibility. So back to global presets. This is where you can trigger any one of the global presets. And what's different about as its name suggests, it's a global preset, and what that will mean is it will change every single setting in terms of the audio parameters. So it's not just on a per zone basis, it will actually apply it for every single zone. So you could create them as groups that, actually you should do this, that for example, if you only wanted to recall a preset for zone 1 and zone 2, what you would be doing is you would create, what do you want zone 1's preset to be? You'd create another task that is what is preset 2. You'd then create a group from that with both of them, and then that's how you would do effectively a zone preset. This is a global preset, so you've got the capability of doing both schemes of global and on a per zone basis. And finally, we have general purpose outputs that you can trigger a task, again from the scheduler, for example, that you could then trigger one of the general purpose outputs of the product that then goes to some third-party control system, for example. And we're then saying, is this triggering on or is it triggering off? So For example, GPO2 will do nothing because there is no trigger. If we want it to trigger on, then we would change it to green, or if we want to trigger off, it then goes to blue. As we were saying here, you also need to configure the general purpose outputs. So I'll do that right now, just because we're here. And I'm sorry, I'll do that again just so that you can see that. There is also another help file on how the general purpose inputs work. With all of these helpers, you can tick to say don't show them again if you don't want them to show every time you go in. But what we're then saying here is that you have to configure how is the output working. At the moment, none of them are set to any function. So even when the task triggers, nothing would happen. And it's because you need to say that you want it to be a logic level or you want it to be a pulse. So you need to make sure that you're going to set it in here in addition to the triggering of the task. And again, we'll show the general purpose inputs and outputs in more detail, specifically the inputs. I'm sorry, I'll show you that right now. But in terms of the general purpose inputs, you have all of these features that it can trigger. And for example, if you run a task, sorry, I'll need to save this. So what I'm doing now is I'm saving all of the tasks that I just created into the ZONEMIX. And then if I come back into the tasks and come back in here, what you will now have is that when you want to run a task, you've got the ability to select any of these tasks or the task groups. So everything that I'm showing you in terms of the task creation, it can be triggered from the scheduler, which I'll show you in a moment, but it can also be triggered from the general purpose inputs, and it can also be triggered from the wall panels. So just because I'm showing you that, I'll show you the wall panels at the same time. So you can come into the WP10, for example, you can come down to one of its buttons, you can then say run a task and then select one of them. So as an example, this one was the volume adjustment of zone 1 and 2, I think it was, that I set. You could then, from that one button press, activate that volume change. So if we then go back into the scheduler, into the tasks, and that is all of the actions that you can configure in the system. I've explained the groups, and you can, I'll do one more just to show you that you can then have play a message and then trigger a general purpose output. So all of that flexibility that you can do there, and you can then change the timing of that. You play a message, wait 5 seconds, and then trigger a general purpose output. Finally, within the task management, there is a day group. This is a specific view that helps you for school applications or where you need a pre-assigned whole day schedule. So if I create a group, what I'm then going to do is come in here and add tasks to it. Now, these messages, if you can imagine, they are bells, for example, in a school. But what you do is you can then come in here and add in multiple bells into the day, and then it creates a whole day. Now, I'll obviously won't do all of them here, but you could then set that, and you could say that that is at 9 a.m., sorry, 9 p.m., that's at 11:10, etc. But you're then setting up the schedule for the day, that each hour it's playing a bell, and then that is the view for, sorry about that, that would be considered a normal day for the school. So we've now set up all of the tasks, and what you can then do is create schedules based on those tasks. So we're then going to select this group 2. You can then change the name of it and say that is zone volume change, for example. And then you can say that is on a recurring schedule, it's weekly, we'll make it every single day. And then you want that to happen at some 9 AM, for example, that if they've been playing loud music the night before, you want to readjust the music at 9 AM to a softer level. You can then make the adjustment here. You can say you never want it to end, just should always happen, and you create that schedule, and then you see it created into the calendar. You can create as many tasks and schedules as you wish, and then you can color code them here just for easier selection of them. So I'll just create one other just so that you can see it. And also you can then say, just for the sake of it, I'll change it to monthly, that we could say on the 1st of every month. And you have all of these different options here for really highly customized schedules. So I'll just create that one. So you can then see it's then being created on the 1st of April. And then I move the calendar forward, and then you'll see it's on the 1st of the next month. Then in terms of the creating day schedules, this is for school applications and has a very specific view that goes with it. So we're going to create a new schedule. The start and end time, you adjust that to whatever you wish. And then coming in here, it's then given me one option. Now, the reason it gives me one option is because there was only one day group assigned to it. So I'll go back and show you that. So in the day group, there was only one normal day. I'll just create one more just so that we can see that. So come into create day schedule, and you can now come in here and select in-service day. Now, that's maybe a bad example. You wouldn't normally want to select that. So what you can do is you can select a normal day, and as it explains in the notes here, if you apply only a schedule only to week 1, that is basically making a weekly schedule. If you then apply it to week 2, that's going to create a bi-weekly schedule, and then a tri-weekly and quad-weekly schedule. So again, you've got that flexibility in terms of if the school has varying, it does one schedule 1 week, another schedule the next week, then that's where you would do week 1 and week 2 and configure it accordingly. Once you've done that, you could then apply that into the system, and then you will see these, because they are whole day schedules, they then have this mark beside them so that you can differentiate them from normal tasks. So that is the schedule that has then been created, that you have the first week, the second week I only had 1 day, the third week, etc., etc. Now, one thing I'll just highlight here that may be confusing, I created the schedule, but it started at 12. Now, sorry, what am I saying? No, sorry, I was confused there. Sorry. So it's the reason it started on the 5th is because I started it on the 5th. What I was going to say is if you set the date to a prior date in history, it's not going to apply it into the calendar because it's in the past. And why would you have it in the past? It's never going to happen. So if you see schedules not being applied in the calendar, just be careful of the start date that you have applied to it, and that it is in the future, or it won't be applied into the calendar because there's no point. You also have the ability, if you're selecting any one of these from the calendar, you can then right click and come in and edit the schedule directly in here. So that gives you the ability to do all of your editing within it. You can also use the edit and delete buttons up here. So sorry, I was right clicking on it, on the task in order to get the sub menu, or you can just select them from up here. If you're then going much further into the future, you can then come back and jump to today, and it's then highlighted there as today. So relatively standard stuff here. You can default the scheduler as well if you need to remove all of the settings to it, and there are far more detailed information in the manual on how the scheduler operates. And I'll save that. So all of that gets saved to the ZONEMIX, and it's important that you do save it to the ZONEMIX or it won't actually action as expected. Okay, so one thing to highlight actually here is this, where it's saying this may take a while. What this is doing is it's applying in the schedules for all of the school calendar. So that's why it's taking a while. That has a lot of entries that it needs to save into the system. I'm sorry, Peter, what was that? Yes, please. Moving on to the general purpose inputs and outputs. I touched on this before in terms of the task management, but here are the features that the general purpose inputs provide, that you can trigger the master override. And as I was mentioning before, that could be from a audio input source, or it could be from this general purpose input. So that's where you would configure it here, that you would say, I want it to be the master override. It's giving you a warning here that you need to actually configure the settings of it. And that is in here. So it basically gave me a warning to say that the master override had not been activated, and I need to activate it in here in order for it to work. Okay, you can then come in here, you can run tasks as I previously showed, recall presets, turn the scheduler on and off, and then you also have the ability on the general purpose input and the wall panels to override the current day schedule. So a good example of that is what I have here, that if we were running a normal day in a school, but it in fact was a rainy day or it was an in-service day, we could assign this button to override the current day and actually say it's an in-service day. So if the school, it allows the school not to have to go into the software in order to change the scheduler and basically entirely change today's schedule. So you can have a situation that the receptionist is coming in the morning on the wall panel or on a button per the general purpose input. They press a button, it is then replacing today with an in-service day on the scheduler, or equally they could come in and say they want to turn the scheduler off for today, and that would then change the schedule that is played. At midnight, the override is then automatically cancelled and it goes back to the standard schedule for the next day. And then there is also a cancel, that if they applied that override and they made a mistake doing that, you could also then have another button to say, okay, cancel that override, don't do it. And then on the general purpose outputs, that was, as I showed before, in terms of the scheduler, how it can trigger, is it a logic level or is it a pulse? So that is the general purpose inputs. Okay, and we're nearly there. Obviously, we're running nearly to an hour. So some of the more advanced features within the product are the ability to disable the front panel settings. If you've commissioned the system, it's obviously a real problem if an end user comes and then changes all the settings and effectively breaks the setup. So you could adjust by deselecting the various settings of what can be controlled on the front panel of the product and the brightness of the display. You can also save and load configurations. So we would highly recommend you do this when you've commissioned the system, that you save the configuration and keep that safe in case of any problems with the system, and then you can load that back in. There is also an administration screen that allows you to set a username and password before you can access the system. And you can also restore to factory defaults using this button. The final thing I wanted to highlight was the developer mode and the ability to control this from a third party. So using the network, if I come back here, you have the ability to control it via this third party control. it has TCP control or UDP control. I'm sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it supports 2 TCP connections and then unlimited UDP, kind of a definition of UDP. So just be careful when you're setting this up, that if you need lots of controllers speaking to the ZONEMIX, use UDP as a control scheme on the network. So you can turn this developer tab on. And then when you're making changes in the system, it gives you the commands that are actually responsible for that change. So it's a very easy way of using the control software in order to understand what is the command string that I need to send over the network in order to take control of the system. There is a full protocol within the ZONEMIX manual. If I just download that and come to the bottom, I believe it's in here, or is it? Oh, sorry, it's a separate document. Sorry, here. So within this manual, you'll get all of the ALMA protocol that's associated with all of these features here. So hopefully I have covered anything, and if there's any further questions.
There's a couple of questions here.
Yep.
In order of coming in, first from Adrian again. Take it, anything in the schedule, everything in the scheduler is adhering to the properties and preferences set in the main unit. You schedule a place a message and someone talks through the pager, which should set the message volume to off. Furthering that, will it wait to someone to stop using a pager before playing a message back?
Right, so that's a good question in terms of the priority. So if you set the scheduler, that is effectively a message that is being played out of the scheduler. So as I hover over here, this setting includes the bell, chime, scheduler messages, and GPI triggered messages. So if you wanted the scheduler to take priority over paging, you would set that to 1 and this to a lower priority, for example. You do that on all the zones that are required. If you wanted it to mix with the paging, you would then set them to the same priority level, and then you'd move everything down a level. So that's how you adjust the function of the scheduler messages, if it's mixing, if it's taking priority over, or if it's deferring to the paging announcements.
And next question, how can the school know the current state of the system and the current settings? Is there a basic version or way to display current settings to the user?
So I am assuming that what that question is meaning is there a basic view of this? At the moment, no, there is not. The other way of looking at it from a basic settings view is from the front panel of the product as well, that will give you all of the volume settings, and they can see that without giving them access to all of this. But at the moment, that is a feature that is being looked at from the software development, and maybe in a future release, in terms of, for example, graying out these features so that they only have access to basic volume levels, for example. But that is currently not available.
And lastly, can the ZONEMIX output IP or RS-232 commands, or only accept?
It can only accept IP settings. There isn't the capability of it generating commands to a third party. Okay, I think that's it for the questions. So that is everything for this ZONEMIX webinar. We'd like to thank you very much for joining. Anything that you want to add, Peter?
No, just thank you everybody for joining. Thank you for your time. If you've got any further questions on this, contact us, either you or myself directly, or through your account manager or company, and we'll address the and address those questions for you. These have both been, both this and the previous webinar have been recorded, and we'll make those available to you soonish. And that's really all I've got to say. Hope everybody got something out of it.
Excellent. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good day.